Good stuff. Well, let's bring on our guest of honor. He is a guy that if you were on the live feed and in between, when you weren't in a breakout room, he's a guy that I've had a chance to hang out with a couple of times at GoBundance events. He's a GoBundance brother of mine. He's an investor out of Oregon, Portland specifically, and is, from what I see of him and what I know of him, a doting father and just a good all-around guy. He's got some great perspectives on government intervention, what's going to happen in the real estate sector, some other thoughts that kind of wrap into that, and then his opinion on what's next, what to do. Really interesting stuff. Like I said, get your pens and pencils out and learn a ton tonight from Mr. Mike Nuss. Mike, what's going on?
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. I'm excited to be here.
Excited to have you. I'm going to get out of your way. You're going to share a slide show?
Yeah, we'll do that. So
beautiful.
You guys see that?
Yep. While he's bringing that up, everybody, what I'd ask of you is this. This is to be interactive. So as we go along, as we go through this presentation, as Mike goes slide by slide, if something jumps out at you, a question you have, throw your digital hand up if you would, please. And let me get myself out of the way here. Throw your digital hand up so that he can see it, so that we can get the question up. And I'll moderate that, Mike. I'll keep an eye out for it. No need for you to, but we can stop at points and have him clarify or speak more about or whatever the case may be. But let's make sure that all of you get the information you're looking to out of this presentation. So with that said, Mike, take it away.
Love it. Yeah, I like questions. I prefer to be a teacher, not a preacher. So questions and interaction is really what I go for. Like Jamie said, this is action packed. So there's going to be some stuff I really speed through. I think I've got like 70 slides we need to get through. But I have given the presentation to Jamie as well. So you guys can have it. I have no problems with that. And you can always reach out for follow-up questions. Quickly, my background, I was an appraiser for 20 years. So I started in 1997, back when I was in high school. I know I look like I'm young, but I'm really old. Started investing in the mid 2000s, learned some lessons, started investing for real in 2009, 2010, started a property management company. So own a property management company, own a brokerage. I'm involved at the city level as a commissioner on commissions. And then we have a similar online community called Investor Lab as well. So we do a ton of education from that. So really today, hobby economist. So if there's one thing that really improved my ability to be a visionary for a company and to be a really much better long-term real estate investor is be really understanding what happens at a macro level. Mistakes I made in the Great Recession, I was not aware what was happening at the macro level, and I was only focused on the micro Portland level. And unfortunately, Portland's market was 1.5 years behind the nation. So warning signs were there. I just didn't see them because I didn't pay attention. So this thing here, a hobby economist, is really what's changed my life and what should hopefully provide some value for us tonight. So there we go. I did do that. So what we'll cover, understanding government intervention, have a ton of really good data and slides on that we'll get into, and then stacks of debt. We'll dig into the ridiculous amount of debt that we created over the past year, how we'll pay it down with financial Repression, and then my takes. Hopefully they provide some value there as well. Main resources, Ray Dalio, follow Ray Dalio, principles.com. He really sums up, he has a cartoon video called How the Economic Machine Works, principles.org, I think. An amazing little thing on the economy. His book, Navigating Big Debt Crisis, highly valuable read right now. It's huge. It's like a Bible. And then pre-order Changing World Order. I'm really excited for this because what you'll see is the way Fed interaction or government intervention is happening now is nothing like it ever has in the past. We've completely gone off the rails from what we've done in the past. We're repeating things at 10x scenarios. And the way that we're creating money is completely different. And so we are going into a whole new different debt cycle. And what that means, we don't really know. But we can look at the past to see what they've done in the past, see how that has affected things, and understand that they are going to manipulate the market. Daniel Ammerman was brought on to me by Cody Littlewood, another GoBro. Really good financial analyst. Most of the slides are from him. If you're really boring, go read this IMF report on financial repression. It'll blow your mind. And then some normal websites where we get some information from. So I really look at this as a rising tide. So I give an economic forecast every single year. This year, it didn't really seem like it was worthwhile to do that. So we went really at a macro level and then have now given this presentation a bunch of times. So think of it as the ocean. The waves are the individual small micro things that are happening, like foreclosure moratoriums, eviction moratoriums, interest rates going up and down, unemployment rate. But the tide, the tide rises while we're going through those waves and declines. And right now, the Fed is in the middle and the government is in the middle of creating a rising tide. And so we'll look at that. So everyone knows home prices are the biggest investment for most private individuals is their home. Here's a quick slide that looks like that. So over a 10-year period of time, your 20% down payment can get a 311% return based on two things. One, prices going up and principal reduction paying down. And in the first 10 years of a 30-year mortgage, you're not getting much principal pay down. So that's really appreciation. That has to do with, again, devaluing of money over a long period of time. So I like to show that for real estate investors. This is a great slide because what we talk about is monetary policy. So we're going to hear words like accommodative and restrictive. So what happened prior to the Great Recession, if you look at mortgage credit availability, we had very accommodative financial policy, right? Anyone could get their loan, you know, your dog, whatever, you could get a loan. You could even negative amortize that loan. So we had very accommodative policy and then a really quick rundown of restrictions that then led to new banking regulations. So this was the culprit of the residential or the housing crisis, right? There was just a systemic financial issues that we had and how we gave out money and lent money. Since then, we've had a very restrictive policy. So even though with COVID, our credit availability has gone down, if you look at it, you know, we're back to 2014 credit availability levels. So the mortgage market is functioning. It's functioning very well. The Fed has done a very good job accommodating that market through COVID. So we're not having 2008 type syndrome. So when we talk about 2008 versus now, fundamentals are completely different. I am not concerned about a residential real estate crash by any means because it's completely different. So the business cycle. So we going back to 1854 is when we started measuring business cycles. And you can see right here a huge change in business cycles, right? You can see that in the graph. And if we dig in on that, if we look at prior to the average business cycle for the entire time, 160 years or whatever that is, 40 months of expansion, 18 months of recession. If we just look at the 1940s and after, now that change is completely different. So 46 to 18, 68 months of expansion, 12 months of recession. So as the Fed separated itself from the federal government, which it did by act in 1950, recessions have gotten 33% shorter and expansions have gotten 70% longer. And so this is just government intervention affecting business cycles on IT. Great way to look at that from these slides here. So there's tools that the Fed uses to manipulate money. So monetary policy tool number one, raise and lower interest rates. We all know that, right? That's kind of one of their mandates is they cover how much money is in supply in the overall economy, and then they manipulate interest rates. So on average, they've lowered it 7 to 8% during a crisis. Okay, and so essentially a crisis happens. What is the first thing they do is they lower interest rates to then get people to borrow money, incentivize people to borrow money to put money back in the economy. Problem is we over the past 4 recessions, we've done more than that. And now we have ridiculously low interest rates. So the gunpowder monetary policy tool number one is essentially gone. So then we create monetary policy number two, which is quantitative easing. So we started that again in 2008, hadn't been done since the 1930s in the Great Recession. And it was not done in the way in 2008 and beyond how it had been done back in the Great Recession. So that's just to simply purchasing financial assets, bonds and treasuries, right? And if you think about it, big institutional investors own these bonds and they own these treasuries. So when the Fed steps in to buy them, now they're liquidating investor positions, right? So you think of it, you own a bunch of real estate, you have a big hedge fund come in and buy all your real estate. Now you're flush with capital gains. What do you need to do with those capital gains? You now need to put those back into the economy, reinvest them, so that way you put that money to use. So that's how quantitative easing works, is the Fed can't lend money, but it can buy assets to put money into the economy, get it circulating. One thing that kind of creates inflation. And then monetary policy tool number three, so that's fiscal and monetary policy coordination. So the federal bank, or excuse me, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, all they can do is lend money and print money. The Treasury, the US government, spends money. So monetary policy tool number three is exactly what we've seen happen since COVID, where we have different government spending, Treasury spending facilities happening at the same time, all different types of credit facilities being opened up by the Fed so they can lend more money. So the Fed is getting money into the economy by lending to investors or by buying financial assets from investors. At the same time, the government so that's top-down money. And at the same time, the government's now giving bottom-up money in the form of stimulus checks, PPP loans, those types of things. So we're not going to get into monetary policy number 3 a whole lot. Ray Dalio, if you check out his LinkedIn, he writes a really, really good article on it, and that's a good way to deep dive. So let's talk about monetary policy tool number 1. So here's the interest rate. So you can see here's the flat line from 1962 to 2000. That's the average interest rate over that period of time. It's over 6%. But thanks to the dot-com crash, we did a historic rate reduction. And then again, in 2008, we did another historic rate reduction. So if you look at the average interest rate from 2001 to 2019, it's under 2%, right? And so now that's the floor. We've created a floor of interest rates, which then makes increasing and lowering interest rates a much less effective tool, right? We can't lower it 7% unless we get into negative interest rates, and that creates even more adverse activity in the economy. So with that tool being gone, we need to get into monetary policy number 2. So you can look at the interest rates as recessions, right? So we'll go here to the dot-com crash, right? So dot-com crash, we sank interest rates. The economy did pretty good. We started increasing interest rates, and then we had the Great Recession, and then we dropped them to a floor. So we got down to like a 0.5% here, and then we got to 0% here, and then we kept it at 0% for 7 years. You can see that we try to increase interest rates again. Then we started to taper. So there's some taper tantrum talk that we'll get into. And then we had COVID and dropped the floor out of interest rates again. So what I like this graph, because it's the average home price equivalent to a 2017 dollar back from 1975. And you can see an upward trend with our financial bubble that we created and then what's happened since then. These two graphs show again, here's our average line of our interest rates, and the funds rate typically comes back to average. So that's what we've seen below average. They raise the rates, it comes back down to average, it goes below our average, raise rates until we get into, again, the dot-com crash and the Great Recession. So you can see outliers. So here's where they shrank the value of the interest, or they dropped the bottom out of the interest rates, and how we had that outlier for the early 2000s. Then we had the increasing interest rates up to the Great Recession where they dropped them again, and then we've been in this outlier environment. Well, if we invert this, or if we look at home values during this period of time, it's an inversion of the same exact graph, right? So here's our average.
Mike, before you continue, David, I see you have a question. Why don't we see if we can? I don't want to get too far down before you get your question in. So go for it, David.
Yeah, I just was wondering. You were saying about how they tried to raise interest rates, like at the recently, and then they dropped out again. Yeah, right there. Yeah. Yep. Didn't that just happen because of COVID-19? Like, if wasn't for that, do you think things would have?
No, we'll get into a taper tantrum. So we had an inverted yield curve in 2019, and that's what caused that. So I've got some good slides on that. And then also, if you look at the Dow Jones, if you look at 2017 to 2018, so we had a very accommodative policy here. So here's a very accommodative policy. Stock market is going like this during that period of time. Here we have a less accommodative policy, and then the stock market flatline. So you can see it in various graphs, and I'll get on that as we go throughout the presentation. Great question, though.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, but you are right. There was a very reactive overnight event that did happen in that scenario because of COVID. So yeah, so we two different points, but same thing. So going back to this graph, completely inverted from the interest rate graph, right? So here's the average home value, and historically we go below, we go above, but we'd always come back to that median line until the dot-com crash, where we got very accommodative, created a bubble, right? And then we had the Great Recession, which then dropped home values, and then again accommodative policy from 2010 to 2012, and now creating that again upward value in home value. So when you look at these graphs, it's very easy to see that what the Fed does from an interest rate standpoint affects real estate, right? We know that affects buyers buy based on monthly payment. And so when interest rates are low, you can afford more of a mortgage. And so that creates higher prices because we're in competition. So, well, I can afford $50 more per month. I'll offer 50 grand more. So that's how buyers think, and it shows up in the marketplace with our valuations. So we can show how monetary policies 1 and 2 were used in action. So 01 to 03, This was the dot-com crash, 50-year low to 0.98%. So that was the federal funds rate was at 0.98%. 2008, they did it to an all-time low down to 0%. So they can't actually go down to 0%. So it's 0 to 0.25. That's the bottom without going negative. So that happened in 2008. So you had a historical event in 2001 to 2003, and then again just 5 years later. And then we maintained that for 7 years. And then we began the first modern era quantitative easing measures. So balance sheet expansions 1 and 2. We got some good graphs in the balance sheet instructions. 2010, we added $1.7 trillion of national debt. This is sounds like a small number now, but that was 3 times the biggest year of national debt increase ever, which was just in 2004. So 508, just under 600 billion was the biggest increase in national debt in one single year. We did 3 times that in 2010, obviously because we are in crisis containment. So we had the Great Recession. Now we're in financial or crisis containment mode. So we have a crisis, then we get in crisis containment, and that's when a policy gets very accommodative. And so that's what we saw. 2016 to 18 was the taper tantrum. So that's exactly what we were talking about there. So markets started to slowly markets from small rate increases. So they're doing small rate increases. At the same time, they started pulling back their bond purchasing. And then the market reacts adversely to that, right? Because we have a market, stock market, real estate market, that's based on accommodative policy. So once they start pulling back from that accommodative policy, now the environment's not the same. So now investors react in different in a different way. So in 2019, we had the dreaded yield curve. So yield curves, for those people that don't know, a yield curve is successfully predicted the next recession, like 10 or 15 recessions down the line. So we got a good graph next that will show that. So immediately they began lowering interest rates, and then they increased their asset purchasing pace. So what happened in 2019, the yield curve inverted, the repurchase market, which is overnight bank lending, the rates skyrocketed. So typically the overnight banking is a very, very low interest rate, but with the inverted yield curve and now concerns of a recession, the overnight rate for banks skyrocketed. So how does the Fed handle that? They start lowering interest rates again, but more importantly, they just make a statement, which is we're going back to 2008 level asset purchasing. So at this point, they had tapered down to like $40 billion a month of asset purchasing. All they did is they made a statement. We're now going to start purchasing $120 billion a month of financial assets, and boom, that yield curve inversion corrected itself. So that's the power of the Fed and their ability to add liquidity to the market. And what we did not do in 2008 is the Fed did not add liquidity to the market right away. We were very slow. So if you look back, the Fed looks back on their policy, the mistakes that they made early on in the Great Recession is they did not do enough fast enough. And so what are we hearing from the Fed now as COVID's happening is we're not worried about the economy getting too hot. We're worried about doing too little, not doing too much. Okay, and so that's their lesson from 2008 that's affected how they're operating in 2009. So here's the yield curve. So anytime that yield gets below 0, recession happens. Below 0, recession, below 0. So here it is in 2019. We went below the yield curve and almost immediately overnight went back over. So the Fed steps in when it needs to, and they're learning that policy, or they're learning through history on how to do that. So asset purchasing, so monetary policy number 2. So here's our balance sheet. So 2008, I've got a disgusting slide that's almost appalling. But in 2008, they made a banking change on how the Fed can create reserves to then create money. So here's our, prior to the Great Recession, kind of the asset sheet. We didn't have much. So quickly we had quantitative easing number 1. So growth number 1 in the asset sheet, growth number 2 in the asset sheet, growth number 3 in the asset sheet. Then we had the taper. So you can see they started to taper. Here's the taper tantrum, 2016 to 2018. They started pulling back how many assets they're purchasing. So they're reducing their balance sheet. And then in 2019, they started purchasing again. So they didn't call it quantitative easing number 4, but that's exactly what they did. So quickly they ramped it back up and increased their balance sheet. So this is the Fed adding liquidity to the market. So that is their job, is to add liquidity to the market. Here's the flavors of monetary policy number 3. It's from that Ray Dalio LinkedIn article. So here's the least direct to the economy, the most direct. What is also true is this is the easiest to pass from a political will standpoint. These at the top are the most difficult to pass from a political will standpoint. So let's look at this. Central bank provides printed money directly to the government. Okay, check. We did that in the first month of COVID. Central bank provides printed cash directly to households. Helicopter money. Check. We did that immediately in COVID. So what COVID did is it created the crisis where all of a sudden we had every single voter from a congressman standpoint on board to create monetary policy number 3 and the most significant amounts or the most effective way of using monetary policy tool number 3. So we were out of policy tools number 1. We still have policy number 2, the quantitative easing, which we're using, but on top of that, now they're adding helicopter money to the equation. So monetary policy tool number 3 in action last year. So immediately they lowered rates to 0.2%. So this was significant because they met on a Sunday. The Feds never met on a Sunday before. And typically when they're increasing or lowering rates, they only do it a quarter point at a time. So if they do a half a point, something significant happened. So not only did they double what is a significant event by lowering it 1%, they lowered it all the way down to what they could, and they met on a Sunday to do that. So with the crisis and pain, the Fed said immediately we're going to take action, and we're going to risk taking too much action, not too less. So they went to, and then also went to financial crisis level quantitative easing. So now balance sheet expansion, actually number 4. $4.5 trillion added to our national debt last year, right? We just talked about 1.7 in 2000, what was that? 2010. So now we did almost 3 times that again, just 10 years later. And then instituted the most effective monetary policy tools number 3 without a thought, stimulus checks, PPE, all that stuff. And then again, rent and foreclosure assistance. That's a lot of stuff, again, that's coming out of the latest stimulus package is money allocated for rent assistance and foreclosure assistance. So the amount of money that's trying to accommodate us through this, so as consumers, we don't feel any pain, is unprecedented, ridiculously unprecedented. And they have the political will to do that, because if you look at the recession, our recession wasn't because COVID would have created a recession no matter what happened, but our government framed how the recession happened. They said, we're going to toss our economy off a cliff overnight, and then we're going to do everything we can to bounce it back up and create a kind of a bungee cord effect. Going back to that, unprecedented lending programs, they started buying junk bonds. So when you talk about the financial assets that the Fed buys, well, immediately overnight, you had AAA rated corporations that now are no longer AAA rated. So if they're not AAA rated, now they're considered junk bonds. Well, we'll just start buying junk bonds. And we know that they buy mortgages. So they buy single family mortgages through Fannie Mae. So they buy single family. They never bought commercial mortgage bank securities. So then they started buying commercial bank securities. Why? Because apartments, retail, office, there's a concern about what's going to happen to the commercial market. So they started, again, propping up the economy and adding liquidity. And then immediately when you add liquidity, now that allows the economy to function. We can lend money, we can borrow money, and that's all a byproduct, or GDP is a byproduct of all those things happening. So here's our yield curve. For the first time ever, every single, the 10-year, the 30-year, the 5-year, and I think the 2-year all went below 1% for the first time ever. So as we had this crisis happen, you had a huge race to then these safe assets, which are treasuries, right? So as we have a whole bunch of demand coming into the treasuries, the price increases for the treasuries, which means the yield goes down. So that's the safe haven assets. That's the effect that you get after that. So an unprecedented event because, oh my God, the world's going to end. Let's just sink all of our money into treasuries. We got some good graphs to look at, see what that looked like as well. So coronavirus crisis, fastest crisis ever. So bear market on average is 14 months, maybe a month. The stock market came back ridiculously fast. Recessions on average are 15 months. We measure recessions looking backwards. But there's a lot of data to suggest, going in, they say we're in a recession when we have two back-to-back quarters of negative GDP. So we hit that in quarter 3 of last year. And then we've already had two successive quarters of increasing GDP. So pretty easy to say we're out of a recession. It won't get defined that way when they look back on it, but the way it's typically looked at, it's there. So here's the Dow Jones. So this is 1 year, June. That's not what I wanted to show. The next one, let's look at the 5 years. So we have this check mark recovery, right? So we're already, and it's even higher now. This was as of March. We're at what, almost 34,000 in the Dow Jones now. So that's 10% more than what the high was going into COVID. So our stock market's up 10% from where it was prior to COVID, right? There's only one way that that happens, and that's because of the amount of liquidity that's been added to the market, giving investors money, right? The Fed can't spend money, so they give money to investors by buying their assets, which then redeploys capital through new investments. And then we see that in assets like the stock market, gold, Bitcoin, all that other stuff. Real GDP, so Q1 was down, Q2 was down, significantly down in Q2 because Q1 wasn't fully in, only 1 month of that. And then Q3 up, Q4 up, Q1 is predicted to be up. And then for the entire year of 2021, the Fed just revised their prediction to have 6.5% GDP growth for 2021. So we're seeing significant GDP growth because government spending is a part of that, right? So when the government takes on, so they borrowed $3 trillion just to get through Q2 last year, right? So they borrowed $3 trillion so they could spend $3 trillion. So that plugs the gap of reduction of consumer spending and consumer borrowing. So let's get into the debt. This gets pretty crazy. So the first 217 years of our nation, so from 1776 to 1993, we took on $4.5 trillion of debt. We took on $4.5 trillion of debt in 2020 alone. Let's look at that inflation adjusted. So inflation adjusted, we just have to go 208 years. So from just to 1984. So again, you take on more debt in 1 year than we did in the first 200 plus years of our nation. So that significantly changes what's going to happen from a financial standpoint because we have to handle that debt burden. And how are we going to handle that debt burden? We'll get into that as well. So here's estimated debt, $7 trillion in 2004. Got my cheat sheet here, up to $9 trillion in 2008. So that wasn't too bad. That was a less accommodative period, right? 2004 to 2008, that was creating a bubble. So it was only 9.5% per year of added national debt during that period of time. 2012, almost 15 trillion. So that was early on in the Great Recession. So that was 13.2% per year adding to our national debt. Then the economy started doing pretty good from 12 to 21, we get up to 27 trillion debt. I know it seems like a lot, but that's only 9.7% per year, right? So that's kind of on par with just a normal period of time, just under 10% of added national debt. Here's what we're predicting. So this is usdebtclock.org. It's not perfect by any means, but the prediction is in 4 years, we'll be at $49 trillion of debt. Okay, that's 19.4% per year. So almost double what a a standard year would be like for us. So inflation absolutely has to come, and not necessarily inflation, we'll get into it, but we have to create an environment, a financial environment to eventually pay this down or to shift assets to then reduce its percentage of our GDP. So again, we talked about the expansion sheet. So here's the $4.5 ceiling. So through those expansion sheets, the Fed balance sheet expansions, we created about a $4.5 trillion ceiling prior to COVID, right? So we hit that $4.5 trillion. We tried to pare it back. The market didn't like it. We went back up to $4.5 trillion. So what's happened since COVID? So Daniel Ammerman, this came out early in COVID. I think it was April he put this out. So he predicted where national debt would be as we go through COVID. So he predicted about $7.5 trillion with about 2025, we'd hit $7.5 trillion. Where do you guys think we are today?
Ooh, yeah. Drop something in the comments, guys. I'm gonna guess 6.5. Is it 10? Super's got 10 trillion.
It's closer to 10 than, well, it's right in the middle of that. So where we're at today is almost $8 trillion of debt.
Over 7, I see 8 trillion. Wow.
Yeah. So if we go back, we take that, just under 8 trillion. So where he predicted we'd be in 24, 26, we're there in 21, right? And so this is a steep growth curve. The real growth curve is here, right? The angle of that real growth curve is ridiculously huge. So, and he's a doomsdayer. He's a gold guy, right? So he's a doomsdayer guy. He what actually happened was significantly more than what he had thought. So that's where the Fed balance sheet is. And what we saw, I wish this went back further, but a flat line. So we had a flat line prior to 2008. We'll get to what happened in 2008 because it's almost disgusting. Here's the sources of funding for our debt. You as expected, foreign investors own a good portion of it. The government owns a good portion of it, Social Security and whatnot. The Federal Reserve owned a good portion of it. Mutual funds, a decent portion as well. So that's as of June of last year. So who purchased the debt in 2020? The Federal Reserve did the most of it. Mutual funds did a significant portion. Foreign investors a little, about 400 billion. But the majority of it was our central bank, and it was mutual funds. And so you think about it, the central bank makes sense because they're adding liquidity to the market. So they're buying those financial instruments. They're buying treasuries, increasing their balance sheet. Mutual funds is different. Mutual funds is hot money because mutual funds don't typically invest in treasuries, right? But the world was crashing. So they went to a safe haven, which is the US Treasury. And so now you have mutual funds, which is short-term money going into treasuries. So that sets up a whole nother complication that we're not even going to talk about tonight. But how do you, we can talk about it briefly. So what did we see? We saw treasury yields reduced ridiculously down to about 0.7. The yields got down to about 0.7%. What have we heard over the past month? The mortgage brokers in the room will know this. We've seen bond yields go crazy, right? So bond yields went ridiculously quickly down because we have this hot money flowing in that doesn't want to hold treasuries. They're there for a capital gains event. They're there to make an investment. The value of the treasury goes up as the yield's going down. They can then sell that and then create capital gains. But they ultimately want to be out. So now you have money moving out of mutual funds. So the yield goes back up, and then our interest rates, our mortgage rates then go into that accordingly. So quick talk on that. So the Fed increased their holdings of treasuries by 108%. Mutual funds by 83%, who then started to sell, and then foreign investors by a small amount. So this is a very good thing. So if you follow Ray Dalio at all, kind of one of the keys, he calls it a beautiful deleveraging. One of the keys to be able to get through a deleveraging, paying down debt, is by to have the majority of your debt denominated in your own currency, because you can manipulate your own currency. You can't manipulate another currency. So this is actually a really good thing for our economy, because we can now be accommodative. As we deleverage, we can create inflationary things. So the inflationary forces offset the deflationary forces. That creates a beautiful deleveraging. If you look back to like Germany after World War I, the biggest problem that Germany had after World War I, why they're in a ridiculously difficult time and recession, is they had none of their debt was in their currency because their currency was so devalued. What they actually did is they created a new currency, and they limited the supply of that currency as a way to get money flowing back into their government. So having debt in your own currency is a huge key. That is an advantage that America has going forward. S&P growth. So again, crisis containment, right? So when we're in crisis containment mode, accommodative policies, the stock market goes up, assets go up. Here's our coronavirus crisis. We've already, like we just showed the check mark, right? So we're not even through 2021, and now this is back up and above. So the thing is the government is still framing Corona as a pandemic, as a crisis, right? Even though assets have inflated, even though there's money's flowing through the market, mortgage market's flowing, it's still having a monetary policy as if we are in this crisis, because we are, viruses are not working the way they're supposed to, yada, yada. So we still have this accommodative policy, even though we've pushed back above a previous high, which is just going to push us into bigger highs, because we're in this cycle of easy money, accommodative policy, which pushes assets values up. So this is interesting. So how do we pay off debt? I think we're actually doing pretty good on time. So there's 4 ways to pay off the debt, and really we don't pay off debt. We just reduce it as a percentage of the GDP. So economic growth, when your economy is as big as ours, you just can't have massive growth, right? We're a very advanced economy. You can only get small amounts of growth. So economic growth is not going to solve this problem. Decades of high austerity is something that we just aren't going to do. We don't have the political will to higher taxes and less government spending. We're all going to feel it. You get negative political consequences. So even though Democrats run on a more, higher tax policy and Republicans the opposite, no one ever says, hey, we're going to raise your taxes and we're going to spend less, right? So Biden has a higher tax plan, but he also has a huge spending plan, right? So the $2 trillion infrastructure package just came out. So we're not going to go through decades of austerity because we're going to feel it as consumers, and politicians can't get reelected. Government defaults. So that devastates savings, bonds, and investments we all pay together. We're not going to default on our government debt. That's just not going to happen. It's also easily understood by voters, so it comes with negative political events. We can inflate away the value of the debt, radically slashing the value of money, which we kind of understand. But again, savings and earners take the hit, so we all pay together. So that's not a way that we want to go. And it does affect day-to-day lives, so it could have negative political effects. So those 4 ways to pay down the debt aren't really the best way to pay down debt. I see a question. I'm going to answer this and then we'll get into financial repression. I don't understand. So from Daniel, I don't understand how our stock market and real estate prices continue to increase, and we show that we are out of a recession now. That hasn't made sense to me since almost the start of coronavirus. I see a lot of businesses going out of business. It almost seems like we're seeing isn't real because of our government spending to prop up markets. Yeah, yes and no. So again, you think about it, the unemployment rate skyrocketed, and then it came down quickly. And then the Fed's latest projections is that we'll be at 4.5% unemployment by the end of the year. But we understand, where did that unemployment rate affect? The unemployment rate really affect people that don't buy houses and don't buy assets, right? We affect the hospitality markets, people working in restaurants, servers, that type of thing. So people with money, the ones that buy assets, that buy real estate, that invest in the stock market, Bitcoin and gold, they're getting all kinds of money, because the way that, again, the Fed can't spend money, they can create credit. So if you're already an investor and you're a borrowing worthy individual, you just were able to borrow a lot more money. On the other side, you have the stimulus payments that affect us a little bit. What we're actually seeing is, so JP Morgan Chase stock went down the other day because the outlook for new loans is bad, because people are paying down their credit cards. Right? So there's actually having this effect of really reducing consumer debt. And businesses outside of PPP are reluctant to take on new debt because of uncertainty. So what we're seeing with real estate now is just ridiculously interest rates. So interest rates were 4% in 2019, and they're 2.5% in 2020. Well, you do the math on that. How much more debt can you afford? I had some really good graphs. I should have kept them in here. But if you look at in Portland specifically, in 2008, based on 2008 mortgage rates, you could buy a $400,000 mortgage. In 2020, you could buy a $650,000 mortgage, just because the interest rate was lower, right? So that is what creates values higher, because buyers don't buy based on value, they buy based on monthly payment. So if they can get a $600,000 loan in 2020 and it has the same payment as it was in 2008, cool, let's just pay 200 grand more because my monthly payment hasn't changed. And so that's how it's showing up in real estate. Yep, liquidity going into the markets, exactly. So people that got hit worse don't own 100%. You nailed it, Mitch.
Hey, Mike, there was a question or a comment from Jake. I think you're probably going down the path. It seems like a pipe dream. If we think the government's going to start actually paying down debt, don't they have too many obligations that they already can't fund? I have a feeling you're going there, but
yeah, because they do it very, very, very sneakily, and they've done it before. And that's the sad thing, is we're from World War II, the entire world paid down their debt to a significant amount by the 1970s, and no one really even knew it happened. And so that leads us, perfect segue into financial repression. So this is actually how we pay down debt. So we did it 70% from 1945 to the 1970s. We reduced debt approximately 70% on a world agenda. So this is a definition, Daniel Ammerman's definition of financial repression. So I'll read it because it's significant. Use 5 tools together to create a combination of very low interest rates and somewhat higher rates of inflation. So we have negative yield that effectively uses private savings to pay down public debts in a manner that is complex enough that the average voter never understands how it works, thus allowing governments to use this potent but subtle method of taking vast sums of private wealth year after year, decade after decade, with almost no political consequences. So again, he's editorializing is that what it's the media play, right? He has an agenda, he sells things, and so he's got a ploy there, but that's exactly what it is. It's stealth. We don't really realize how it's happening. So the next series of graphs, stealthy, almost no political backlash. So these next series of graphs show how it happens. So here's national debt as a percentage of our economy. You can see it was just over 90% in 2010. 2019, when he published this, it was just under 110%. You want to see where it's at now? 127%. So we saw early on in Corona, and then we saw these adverse reactions last year. That's because GDP shrank and it grew, right? So we had ridiculous drop of GDP and a ridiculous increase of GDP. So that creates this really adverse effect. But debt, our national debt, increased significantly because, again, we took on $4.5 trillion of debt last year. So it's like 27% of GDP right now. So how are we duped into paying down debt? So number one is inflation. So these are the 5 tools. So we understand inflation is devaluing currency, right? So, and it doesn't have to be high for financial repression to work, but it does have to exist. We have to have inflation. The higher that inflation rate is, the faster the debt pay down happens. Negative real interest rates. So not saying negative interest rates, but low yield investments that are less than inflation then create a negative yield, okay? So shorter term treasuries and bonds, less than 2% yield right now. Inflation target is 2%. So if inflation's at 2% and yields on low yield investments is less than 2%, then that investment is actually losing value or losing money year over year. And then that is how the government starts paying down their debt. So number 3, funding by financial institutions. So incentivize monetization of government debt. So we change all the banking regulations, which then now says banks have to take on our debt. Banks, credit unions, insurance companies, they have to hold treasuries, right? Because that's part of their reserve requirement now from new banking laws. So they're holding treasuries at yields that are less than inflation, which then funds the government debt, right? So the government takes on debt, they sell it to these institutions who get their deposits from savers, right? So they make their money by margin. So they're effectively shifting the debt burden pay down to people who put money in the bank, right? So savers. So savers are putting money in the bank, their money market, they're getting, 0.02 return on their money. Then the banks use that to buy treasuries that are less than 2%, and then we create inflation greater than 2%, which then creates a downward spiral. That investment loses value, which allows us to fund the pay down of our government debt. So this is what it looks like. So this is the securities. This is the Federal Reserve's holdings of U.S. Treasury securities. So look what happened after 2008. And this is where it gets really disgusting. So we took on $2.4 trillion of securities in the past, decade, little more of a decade. Banking regulations changed in 2008. Okay, and then we had more Dodd-Frank changes in 2010. So these reserves were not required. So this is excess reserves of depository institutions. So banks, insurance companies, credit unions, they were not required to own treasuries. In 2008, they're now required to own treasuries. So how much treasuries do they own? 2.4 trillion. How much treasuries has the Fed bought? 2.4 trillion. So that's as of 2014 of this graph. So by creating a banking regulation change, now we use savers who deposit money at banks, who then banks now buy government treasury securities combined with our Federal Reserve. That's how they were shifting the burden of debt pay down from savers, right? From taxpayers to savers, right? Because if it's just taxpayers paying us down, then we have to do austerity, and we don't want to do austerity. So we stealthily shift that burden to people who put money in the bank, and then make the banks hold our debt, so which allows us to then push it off to savers. Capital control. So we incentivize domestic savings. So what do? You start scrutinizing foreign deposits, right? So then what do foreign banks do? They don't allow us to open bank accounts, right? Because they've got so much scrutiny from the US government that will penalize them. So then they just don't allow Americans to open banks. So we have to keep our money in America. right? One of the big tax increases right now that Biden's talking about is corporate profits overseas and bringing corporate profits back into America and taxing them. And then tax incentives for certain type of investment vehicles like life insurance. So you don't pay taxes on life insurance, right? So what do life insurance companies do? They buy treasuries, right? So you invest in life insurance, whole life insurance at a nominal rate. They go invest in other vehicles to create a bigger rate. But part of that is they buy treasuries. So again, we now incentivize people to put money in certain places, and then those places use that money to go buy government debt. And then precious metal control. So we won't get deep into this, but like gold, capital gains out of gold's taxed at a 28% rate. And if gold is really just a store of value, so if the dollar's devalued by 50%, gold doubles in value, right? But the purchasing power hasn't doubled. The purchasing power is the same. Okay. The problem is the gold doubled in value. So if you sell it, now you're paying taxes. So even though it's a store of money, and now you can buy the same post-inflation as you were able to buy pre-inflation, you're going to have to pay taxes on that money if you want to access it. So they have controls over precious metals as well. So there's that scenario. So let's look at some graphs. I think, did I go too far? Okay, so let's look at some graphs. So here's the national debt, the US national debt from 47 to 2018. So post-World War II, like we talked about, they were able to reduce it significantly into the 1980s. So this is big debt cycles, right? Ray Dalio talks about debt cycles. So here's a resetting of a debt cycle. It's funny, on the national or in the global scale, so these all global advanced economies, it's almost the exact same curve, right? Very, very, very similar curve. So it starts in 47, that previous graph started right here, and it's almost that exact same growth curve because we're going through debt cycles together. So let's look at inflation. So this is $100,000 invested at a normal 5% yield, right? So yields on low risk investments used to be 5%. I remember when I did estate planning in 2006, it was like, oh yeah, you know, you buy some bonds and mutual funds will get you a 5% return. That was a normal yield. We're no longer in a normal yield. We'll get into that. But if at a normal yield, after 20 years of that 5% yield, your 100 grand turns into 265. But if you have 3% inflation, the real value of that $100,000 investment is only $147,000, right? So this inflation is eating away at the value of your investment. So let's look at the difference of a past normal yield to our current yield. So now current yields are ridiculously low, right? If you go put money in the bank, your money market, you're getting a ridiculously low yield. So the blue columns would have gotten you up to 265,000. With the current yield, we're only getting to 110,000, right? Because we don't have yield, we're not compounding that wealth over a period of time. So that has a significant effect on our ability to grow wealth. So now let's combine the normal yield with the low yield and then adjust it for inflation. So here's what we were without any inflation. Now we take our current low yield environment and then we add on 3% inflation, and now the value of our investment actually declines. So we lose $39,000 of value on that $100,000 investment in 20 years. And that is slowly year over year eroding wealth from savers and investors and giving it to the government to pay down their national debt. And this is what it looks like. So here's our national debt. Here's what it would be, 140% of our GDP based in 1970. But if we adjust it for inflation, it's significantly less, right? So the amount of the dollar value, the gross amount of debt hasn't changed, but the dollars that we're paying it off with are much lower they have less purchasing power. So it's just essentially we're borrowers, right? So as real estate investors, what do we want to do? We want to borrow debt now at a fixed rate and pay it off with a lower value dollar down the future. The government does the exact same thing. They just do it in a stealthy manner. And then percentage of the economy. I can't remember why I had that again. Okay, so now let's talk about Federal Reserve policy, because this is significant, right? You have to have inflation and you have to have low interest rates in order for financial repression to work. So mandates. So 1977, the Federal Reserve Reform Act, inflation control. So set price stability as a national policy goal. And then the year later in 1978, Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act. So that was the unemployment rate. So those are the Fed's two mandates, right? So they want to create price stability, inflation control, and they want to create full employment. So whenever we talk about the Fed meeting minutes, they're based on, well, the unemployment rate's this, inflation's this. They're changing their policy or how much, where interest rates are at, or how many assets that they're purchasing based on where unemployment is and where inflation is. So the previous policy, so what happened was in 2019, the Fed did a year-long study of past Fed interactions. So they looked at policy going back in time and how that policy worked or did not work. So they did the study in 2019. Then in 2020, they changed it. So preemptive policy is prior to 2020. So they use monetary policies 1 and 2 to try and achieve full employment and target inflation. Meaning if inflation was starting to go up, they would increase interest rates to taper it down. So they were trying to hit a target, right? We don't have enough inflation, so they lower interest rates to create inflation. So they've got a target in mind and they're manipulating interest rates to try and hit that target. So it's a preemptive policy. Now the new policy out of 2020 is reactive. So now their policy is keeping average inflation at 2% over time. So what that means is, since our economy's been running under 2% inflation for a long period of time, we need to let it run above 2% inflation so it averages out. So instead of them being preemptive and trying to keep inflation where they want, they're going to let it do what it does. And then when it finally gets to a point of where they want it and it sustains that over a period of time, then they'll do something. But now they're going to be reactive. They're not going to be preemptive. So they're going to let inflation run hot, which means they keep interest rates low, right? So what are the two main components of financial repression? Inflation exists. Inflation is greater than interest rates. So their policy is to keep interest rates low and let inflation run hot. So their new policy framework sets up financial repression to work. So they're working hand in hand to help the government pay down their debt over a period of time. And so that's what their new policy is. I thought I had a good graph. Yes. Okay. So now inflation. So let's talk inflation, right? So you can see we've had less than 2%. Here's the 2%. So there's their target inflation rate. We've had less than that for a long period of time. Inflation now came out. We just had the latest CPI report and it was high. It was like at 2%. But that's because we have a basis problem because of COVID. So what you're going to hear is, bond investors are really concerned about inflation. Everyone's talking about inflation. We're seeing inflation show up. Typically, how the Fed measures inflation, we don't see it, right? Because they're not looking at assets. They're looking at consumer price index. What we're seeing now and how inflation is getting reported is a baseline effect. So if you look at pre-COVID to now, we've seen a very small increase in inflation, right? But the headline report is inflation's up 2% year over year because it was so far low early on in Corona that when you compare it to this point in time here, which is part of here, you've got this huge gap. So we have an unreal inflation reporting problem. So reports of consumer prices are going to say inflation's happened, but we actually haven't really seen inflation happen yet. We've seen it in assets, but we haven't seen it in consumer prices outside of some exacerbated things like lumber and those types of things. So what that means is we have an environment where the Fed can still allow inflation to run hot. Here's a quote that I wanted. So this is from Jerome Powell's comment yesterday. So most members of the committee, the open market committee, did not see raising interest rates until 2024. Okay. They've been saying 2023. Now they're talking about 2024. That isn't a committee forecast. It isn't something we vote on or act on as a group. It just really is our assessment. Markets focus too much on what we call the economic predictions, and I would focus more on the outcomes we've described. So that is a monetary shift. So historically, our markets are based on economic predictions. You know, the stock market, the bond market moves based on what the Fed's going to do to hit their target rate, right? They're going to manipulate interest rates so they can get their target rate of inflation. Now he's saying, I would focus more on the outcomes that we've described. So actually focus on what inflation is. And then once we've seen inflation and once we've seen it sustained, then we'll react and we'll lower interest rate or increase interest rates. So we're we're already in accommodative monetary policy, and it's going to be much slower to react. So instead of trying to predict what the Fed gets to do going forward, we actually get to see the economics happen, and then the Fed will react. So we're actually in a policy going forward, which allows us to be, we have more evidence to base our decisions off of. So why have we not seen inflation? So survival and stimulus capital plugged a gap of reduction in spending and borrowing. So GDP is measured by the amount of spending and borrowing going on in the market. Inflation is measured by the amount of money in the market and how fast it moves. And so what happened is early on in Corona, we just stopped spending money, right? We stopped going traveling, we stopped going out to bars. So there's a reduction in spending and a reduction in borrowing. And so the survival capital and stimulus capital have just plugged a gap. We actually haven't gone beyond that yet. And so that's why it's not really showing up outside of assets, because we know we've flown money into the economy to the people that purchase assets. The other thing, which we won't get into, is the Fed hasn't really printed new money. The thought process is the Fed is just printing new money. What, again, that 2008 change is now they have what's called reserves-based monetary creation. Super complicated. We're not going to get into it, but they don't actually have to print money to add money to the economy. They can now take some of their treasury, some of their balance sheet, call that reserves, and then that allows them to put more money in the economy. It's really complicated. I don't really understand it yet, but no one actually knows how much money we've printed. That won't come out until we get the president's economic report, which is an irregular printout, and we don't get that very often. So we don't even actually know how much money we printed. But we will probably get to a point where we need to print more money. So we should expect inflation to happen. CPI does not measure assets. We talked about that. The Fed lends, not spends. So again, money's going into investors' hands, not necessarily into consumers' hands. And so the investors are reinvesting that capital, which is that increased value of assets. My takes, we'll get into this. Rising tide. So low interest rates, we talked about that. That pushes assets higher. Janet Yellen, she was part of the Fed. She ran the Fed. Now she's our Treasury Secretary. They're not going to raise rates for a long period of time. Now, again, mortgage rates are different than the Fed borrowing rates, but that does influence rates. More financial assets being purchased forces lower yields for financial assets, which then forces investors to search elsewhere for yield, moving funds into hard assets, stock market, Bitcoin, gold, and real estate. So if you think of what happened after the Great Recession, Blackstreet, I think is their name, they started buying single family homes at ridiculous levels, right? And then they turned in single family homes into a fund and then sold it on Wall Street. So Wall Street owns single family homes. They're now starting to do that with multifamily homes, right? So that's chasing yield, going into different asset classes in order to chase yield. So I predict that we're going to start seeing even more Wall Street money into real estate. So it compresses cap rates, right? So reduction in yield. If you don't have good places to invest your money to get yield, money flows into real estate. That lowers cap rates, which then increases value. Haven't seen consumer inflation yet. We talked about that. Highly influenced by Fed actions. We know that. We've triggered Fed actions without hitting housing prices. So that's the beauty of real estate, is that market moves really slow. The stock market crashed because that can change overnight, but the real estate market cannot move that fast. So the Fed, the mortgage market was able to figure itself out early on Corona. So we had like a 2-week slowdown before lending regulations came, lending became back and the market started flowing again. So we got this triggered Fed actions that are going to trigger upward pricing without actually lowering values in prior to that happening. Inflation is showing up in assets. We talked about that. So we are headed into monetary policy number three. Last stimulus program just got passed. Infrastructure is going to get passed. And then Biden has a debt package he wants to do. So he wants to increase, he wants to bring back the first-time homebuyer tax credit and double the amount. So from $7,500 to $15,000, and they're going to make it advanceable. So instead of getting a credit on your tax return, you can actually get that money up front to go buy real estate. Okay, so you have more policy at the Treasury level that's going to affect as well. Low interest rates trigger refi booms and they increase feasibility for rentals, right? So the move-up buyer, so the person who sells their home to buy another one, now they can get such low interest rates, and we've had rental increases. Now they don't have to sell their home to buy another one. So what used to be a net neutral on the supply level is now a negative to supply level. So they're buying a home, so they're pulling inventory, but they're not adding inventory. So again, exacerbating supply levels. So demand strong, supply levels low. We'll go through this. Drivers limiting supply. There's plenty of them out there that's limiting our supply. Drivers increasing supply a couple, but increasing prices. People still are not coming to the market with their properties, and I don't know that we will for a while. And then the vaccine isn't working the way it's supposed to be. So again, there's that physical fear. Demand drivers, plenty of demand drivers of why demand is high, and then not much reducing. Not much drivers reducing demand. So I expect demand to stay really high. How do we proper volatility? Just prepare for a volatile market, big upswings and downswings. That's going to be the norm. Don't be a saver. Be a borrower. Savers are screwed. If you're saving money, you're going to lose to inflation, and you're not going to have the yield to offset that inflation. Good debt. Don't just take debt on to take on debt. I think it's really smart to have debt, but make sure it's good debt. Make sure it's functional debt, and that the fundamentals of your real estate, they cash flow, because cash flow in real estate is going to be the key to get through the next downturn, whenever that will be. Seller financing, this is huge. So this is the biggest key. I think we were able to borrow. We typically get about $500,000 to $800,000 a year seller financing. Last year we got about almost $3 million in seller financing, because it was the best option for enders, for baby boomers. Their yield, where are they going to put that money if they get cash? They're going to pay capital gains on it, and they have nowhere to invest it. Seller financing allows them to get a good yield without taking that tax hit. So it's a great tool for win-win scenarios. So learn that tool. It's going to be amazing going forward. And we're in an environment where seller financing, 6% interest used to be the norm. Well, why would you borrow at 6% when you can go to the bank and get 4%? So your negotiation power for seller financing is very, very high. And of that almost $3 million of seller financing debt we got last year, it's in the 3% range. It's very, very, very low. Those other things, read and think, and then get outside. So those are my ways to thrive. There's my contact info, and I think we got time for Q&A, or if you want to do a breakout room, it's up to you.
Yeah, no, we'll stay here, but I definitely want to get some Q&A going. I know we had 9:30 as the end on this, guys, but honestly, like Mike gave me the assurance earlier that he's got time past that. So let's get some hands up. Like, first of all, Mike, let me start with this, because that was unbelievable. I read the slideshow, but the way you just delivered all of that was ridiculous, man. That was incredible. So thank you. First of all, a round of applause to you. Thank you so much for that was a good amount of information, and I love the takes at the end. So I appreciate that. What questions do you guys have? Again, digital hand up, or if you want to, for the first voice I hear, we'll let you go unmute yourself and ask the question. But what questions do you have of Mike?
Hi, this is Madhu here from Michigan. So my question to Mike is, first of all, thank you so much. It's a lot of information and very well explained. Thank you so much for that. So my question was that if the asset values keep going up and the investment values keep going up, do you see the income levels also going up? Because let's say the asset values goes up and we invest more, but what if we don't? What if the numbers don't work for us? Yeah. What if the runs don't go up?
Yeah, what I did take out of this presentation is affordability equations. So I don't know if you're like multiple local MLS does affordability equations, but essentially affordability is what's the median income earner, what's their mortgage payment based on the median income buying a median priced home with 20% down, and then the payment on that 80% loan being 25% or less of their gross income. So the factors are, what are the interest rates, what are the incomes, and what are the values to create affordability. Our affordability here in Portland is the most affordable it's been since 2014. So even though prices have gone up, interest rates have gone down at a higher proportion. So as monthly payments have gone down on the mortgages, you can buy more mortgage and actually have your payment less. And so the prediction, so I like to project out. So in January, interest rates are at 2.67%. That was the 30-year from Freddie Mac. So I predicted out, what if we had no income increase? What if we had a 10% real estate price increase? And what if interest rates went up to 3%? Affordability was still 100%, above 100% is good. So affordability was still like at 118% or something. Then I projected, well, what gets us down to 100% affordability? So how high can values go based on a 3% interest rate and a no change in income before we get down to 100% affordability? So it's still an affordable home. So in Portland, that was like a 28% increase in value. So pricing could go up 28% from a median sales price standpoint. Incomes could stay the same and interest rates could go up to 3%. So now interest rates are like at 3.25%. So we've already passed that barrier. But the other thing is unemployment rate does not affect income. So our income for the Portland area just came out. Incomes went up last year. Okay. So now again, you factor income into affordability, it went up, which means prices can go even higher. So it's a balance of payments issue. Consumers don't buy based on value, they buy based on monthly payments. So interest rates have a huge effect on values. And then lending programs. So like we saw in that first slide that we showed 2008 and the very accommodative lending standards creating that bubble. So then what other types of loan programs are out there? So low down home payment programs, FHA, that type of stuff. If you think of our first time home buyer, if you're going to get a $15,000 check from the government to go buy a home, that's going to buy you at 3%. It's going to buy you a $450,000 home. So what we saw in the Portland area was, 300 to 350, that was like the hot first time home buyer market. Quickly that went to 400 grand. Now you just can't, anything under 400 grand sells like that. Now it's anything under 450 sells like that. So that is just a reflection of really low interest rates. And again, what do we need in order for financial repression to work? And what is every leader of the Fed told us? What is the Treasury Secretary told us? We're not raising rates for at least 3 years, 2.5, 3 years. So we can expect a low rate environment. The bond yield market, so yields affect mortgage rates. Those seem to have settled. They've been in that 1.7 range for a few weeks now. So the bond market seems to have settled a little bit. So maybe we can assume that interest rates are going to be in that 3.25 to 3.5. I'll be very surprised if they're 4% by the end of the year. We probably won't see 4% mortgage rates until 2023. So again, that just makes real estate very cheap on a month-to-month basis, which puts upward pressure on prices. And it allows prices to go higher because the monthly payments are so low.
Amazing. That's a great point. People don't buy on value; they buy on monthly. That's what it's set up to be, right? So, very good point, Daniel. We got you on stage here. What question do you have, my friend?
Yeah, I appreciate it, Mike. Thanks for this presentation tonight. It's very informative stuff. And last time I got to hear you talk with Gabriel Hamill, it was awesome. So keep doing what you're doing, man. One opinion I would ask of you, though, is you talked a little bit about government intervention and what they're able to do in terms of the deficit and stuff. My concern has been with how they're impacting landlords and some of the stuff like the eviction moratorium, the foreclosure moratorium. What do you see? Hopefully that changes in the near future. I mean, they've already extended. And we've had a couple of states, Texas and Ohio, that come to my mind where they've been fighting that on the federal level. Do you see that ending anytime soon? And how would that impact us as investors?
Yeah, I expect, part of that is like the CDC, it's the federal, it's the Fannie Mae debt, that type of stuff. That's going to be a federal thing. Locally in Oregon, we've got a whole bunch of bills on the docket that they're going over. So they're trying to create even more policy. At the federal level, I think once we get enough vaccinations out there, then that will go away. That is my opinion, is that it will go away, but it's going to get extended again. It's not going to go away until 2022, right? So I'm just in an environment as I'm negotiating seller financing, I'm negotiating rentals. I'm just assuming that we're not going to have market rents. We're not going to be able to increase rents. We're not going to be able to do eviction for non-payment of rent. I build that into our performance. So I do expect it to last through the rest of the year. People thought I was crazy back in the fall when I said it's going to get extended to March or July here locally. It got extended to March or July. Just talking to a broker today, I said it's going to get extended again. He's like, no way, it's not going to happen. It'll happen. Just like the CDC came out recently and extended it. So expect that policy to be around for the rest of 2021 and start to loosen up in 2022.
if I can just ask one more question of you, Mike, you talked a little bit too about how saving is not a good strategy at this point. But what would you say in terms of trying to balance? Because having rental properties, I need to have some reserves to be able to cover. Like I've got a tenant right now hasn't paid in 2.5 months.
Yeah.
So having some cash reserves while still trying to take advantage of the low interest rate debt to pick up more assets.
And that's again where seller financing becomes a really, really good tool, because a lot of times a seller, I mean, you're on that call with Gabe, right? They don't want money, so you can get really low down payments and you don't have reserve issues. I look at, so we have the cash is trash debate in Breckenridge at GoBundance, and you know, I'm a believer of reserves. To me, isn't saving. Reserves is operating capital, and I have a lot of operating capital in cash, because that's what allows me to buy really good real estate deals, right? So there's a difference between saving and having operating capital. Now, if your operating capital is doing nothing for you and it's losing its purchasing power, then you may want to look at, you know, do you put that in crypto? Do you put it in gold or something like that? But I am a believer, especially as a real estate professional and developer, you have to have operating capital to keep your business going. And, you know, we essentially, when we buy real estate, we print money, right? That's the beauty of being a really good real estate developer, is you can print money on the buy. So you need to have those reserves around so you can then buy the real estate, you know, in and out. So we're moving money in and out of real estate on a regular basis. So that's different than saving.
Great point.
Thanks.
Good stuff, man. No, I appreciate that. Mike, man, amazing. Incredible insight. I thank you again. Can you one more time tell us how people can follow you, learn more about you? What's the best contact? Ben, if you don't mind throwing it in the chat, go ahead. What's the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm not on Instagram a lot, but it's on my phone. So if you message me through there, @RarebirdMike is my Instagram handle. And then Facebook is just Mike Nuss. From a company standpoint, Investor Lab. So I've done a whole bunch of Facebook live videos. If you go to our Facebook page for Investor Lab, there's a bunch of live videos on there where I interview quite a few people. They're doing amazing things. And, you know, some of the people Jamie's interviewed, not like the David Osbornes of the world, but so
we got a few
good content there too. Yeah.
We got to get him on a multifamily more. Actually, I'll keep him from the GoBundance brand. I got to keep those separate, right? The Emerge stuff, Emerge and Ascend, they can have Osborne. Multifamily more, you want Osborne, you got to join Emerge. So amazing stuff, man. I appreciate it. Listen, everybody, a couple people asked like, hey, great info. Am I going to be able to see this again? Absolutely, you can. I'm going to drop this in here. First off, text multifamily to that number. It'll put you in my multifamily text community, and I will message you when this video is available on YouTube, okay? I'll also message you for the next iteration of this meeting on May 12th with Bill Ham at 8 p.m. We're doing Creative Cash, which is a book he just wrote. This is the guy who's scaled very, very big in multifamily, doing all seller financing, to Mike's point. So really, really great virtual mastermind next month. Make sure you join it, but text multifamily to me there, and you'll get a notification from me, notifications of when that's coming up, and the Zoom link. I'll make it very easy for you. In addition, go to youtube.com/multifamilymore. At least subscribe. You don't have to hit the notification bell if you don't want to. I'll gladly text you again once this video's up later this week or early next week, and you can jump on there, partake, share it with your friends, whoever you think needs to know about us. Help us spread the news about this brand. We hope it adds a ton of value to you, and we want to add value to even more people. So with that said, Mike, man, really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I apologize for the fire hose.
For the who?
The fire hose of information.
It was not a fire hose. It was incredible information. It was well laid out, my friend. We got people saying thank you in the chat here. That was really, really good. So thank you for all you did tonight. And thanks to all of you for jumping on tonight. Hope you all have a great evening wherever you are. So thanks again, Mike.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, guys.
See you guys.
Awesome job. Thanks, Mike.